Thank you very much, Ryan, for organizing this event with our Japanese friend. So it's my privilege to be here to facilitate this panel discussion, which is part of this conference. So actually, the reason why I say I'm privileged is because we have 5 panelists this evening to join the discussion. Among them really is many years, if I not say the decades of experiences and expertise to share with us about their thoughts, their experiences, and also their advices. Among them, there's a diversity of experience and knowledge, but one thing in common from my observation is that their passion and their contribution to help business to innovate, to foster, nurture, and support startups and SMEs and entrepreneurs to achieve growth and development, and translate such development to help regional economic to flourish, to create new opportunities. All right, so without further ado, I would like to call upon our panelists to join us, so that we can start a discussion to share their thoughts. Thank you. The first, where the panelists actually coming and take their seats, I would like to introduce them. Please allow me to take some time to go through the introduction because there's so much wealth in their knowledge and experience. So I'll try my best to actually summarize the highlights of their the background. The first panelist I would like to introduce is Mr. Greg Richard. Greg is currently executive manager for business growth and investment attraction at Adelaide Economic Development Agency. He took his role since 2021. Currently, he leads the developing partnership initiative to support businesses to start and to grow, attracting new investments and identifying post-COVID economic opportunities. Prior to this role, Greg actually was the manager for economic development and urban policies at the city of Salisbury from 2011 to 2021, so it's almost 10 years in that role. He was responsible for local response to industrial transformation and a transition towards digital economy development and opportunities. And for business advisory services, as well as responsible for business startup and workshop programs and various projects. So then our next panelist, Ms. Gillian Hewlett. So Gillian actually is from the government. She is the chief of staff to the chief scientist for the South Australia. So Caroline Macmillan she came here and gave a wonderful speech. Gillian actually working with her. She has over 20 years of experience across various policy settings within the government. She has been instrumental in development and implementation of South Australia's 10-year science and innovation strategy, which was released in 2020. Central to her role, she is responsible for powering up South Australia's innovation and translation districts, which you have heard from Caroline earlier. And she has also undertaken an analysis of ASA's science, technology, engineering, math, and I think the medical, called the STEM, research and innovation value chain, and benchmarking the performance of state in the OECD to assess how the state perform into the R&D. So we'll hear more from Gillian. Also to my pleasure to introduce my third panelist, Ms. Paula Bennett. Paula is an economic development officer, industrial development. for business development and stakeholder engagement unit at City of Salisbury. She has been in a role since 2017. She has been actively involved with mining equipment technology, heavy industry, manufacturing, engineering, and fabrication sectors. Her role includes supporting the growth and the job creation potential of businesses in the City of Salisbury, strengthening connections between the region's businesses and the university, which are very grateful for her role. And I'm sure that we are all, from the university point of view, who do need kind of support. Identifying the progressing new industries that complement the competitive advantage of the City of Salisbury. Prior to this role, Paula also had a string of experience of working in public and private sectors for various regional economic development programs and projects. Thank you, Paula. Our next panelist is a very good colleague of ours, Associate Professor Alan O'Connell. Dr. Alan O'Connell is Associate Professor in Enterprise Dynamics, and he is also a co-executive director for the Center for Enterprise Dynamics in Global Economies at the University of South Australia. So his research examines the intersection between the entrepreneurship, innovation, and socio-economic development, which has led to a focus on the entrepreneurial ecosystems and how they work. In 2020 and 2021, he was recognized as Australia's leading researcher in innovation and entrepreneurship by the Australian, which is a newspaper, national newspaper. And Alan has worked in a consulting capacity for organizations seeking to expand their innovation activities and to assist SMEs to confront issues of innovation and growth. Thank you, Alan. Our next panelist is Mrs. Catherine Anderson. Catherine had 5 years at Tonsley, which you have heard a lot about Tonsley in these 2 days, which is the innovation precinct come out of the former Mitsubishi assembly factory. So Catherine actually acted as deputy director of Flinders New Venture Institute. And she also was in the university looking at reshaping Tonsley as an economic development opportunity in light of the structure of change in the southern part of the Adelaide. Currently, Catherine is with us with the University of South Australia as a PhD scholar, working with Professor Andrew Beer, who actually gave a keynote speech yesterday. She is working on an innovation precinct research project with Andrew. So we will hear from Catherine about her experience in Tonsley. That will be very valuable. Thank you. Okay, these are all panelists. To start with the discussion, I would like to throw in a question for all the panelists. Since we're talking about the role of a technology park in boosting regional innovation and development, and from your insight in South Australia. So my question here is, how do science technology parks in South Australia perform? I think that's our curiosity. So how, in your view, that current science technology parks in SA perform? Who would like to give the comment? Yeah, your experience, your knowledge, and your observation. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think I'll start more holistically about how they perform in South Australia, making the point that I think South Australia has the success of the placemaking, which is an important part of what can leverage an innovation district. So we recently have come in as the Australian, the city, the most livable city in Australia, coming in at number 3 in the world, behind Japan's Osaka as number 2, and Tokyo coming in at number 5 before other states. So that's an important connection of how they might perform in sense of that global recognition and branding and what they can mean for the attraction of talent. So how can they become magnets for talent? And some of that place setting, I think, is an important part in how they perform. I think the other part that's important is, I guess, the definitions and the maturity. So if we look at the different ones across South Australia, you can see that, you know, there are some real some that have their eye to global significance. So Tonsley, we've mentioned. Adelaide Biomed City is definitely one that's making that move. It's got the leadership, it's got the 10-year strategy that sets where it wants to be in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. And of course, we're especially curating the Lot 14 that I think is making that connection for entrepreneurs and startups to really boost productivity in the state.
I think the performance is mixed, and that reflects some of the factors that Gillian talked about. But I think it also is what is the metric for determining what success actually looks like? You know, is it commercialization of IP out of university? Is it the number of startups? Is it global links? Is it private sector investment? Is it the ability for government to invest and get a return on that? So I think for each of those, we can give different marks for each of the innovation precincts in South Australia.
Just to expand on that a little bit, and it depends on what perspective you're coming from. So productivity of what, I guess, is my question. So when I look at those kind of aspects of what value add is created through we can look at jobs and jobs performance, and we can look at productivity measures at a state level, but also thinking about what is the value add, because that creation of value is an important part of the wealth creation, which attracts the entrepreneurs, supports the jobs, etc. So I think that's an important metric to come to before you get to thinking about the bigger measures. The other part of this, stepping back and thinking about a state level, is the aspect of economic complexity. If we're really trying to grow the states and grow this great state's performance overall, it's really thinking about, well, what strengths do we have? And this resonates with the smart specialization kind of strategies, but not quite the same. But thinking about, you know, what are we actually innovating in? And are we actually leveraging our strengths very well? And Professor Zhu mentioned earlier today, where's our agri-tech or agricultural kind of sector or precinct? So there's those kind of questions to actually, I think we've got very good performing precincts, but overall, are they connected up? Is the another question that would actually amplify things, and are they in the right sectors to actually boost our economic performance through that economic complexity measure?
I'll just round that out, because I'm going to take that question and unpack it in a different way. So the question was, how do they perform? And we've talked about metrics and the outputs and the outcomes, but there's also another question in that question, which is how do they perform? And I think that's something that is really worth us all thinking about and knowing about, and hopefully it's a good thing, because that's what I'm looking at, is how do they perform? So there's aspects of the complexity. How many people do you need to get in there? How do the people get to know each other? What are the processes that happen there? What makes it magnetic? Rather than put these building blocks together, boom, there it is. Put these building blocks together and what is it about those building blocks, and how do those building blocks interrelate, interconnect, and work together to make it happen?
I guess I represent one of the older innovation precincts in South Australia, and if you go on a metric of success, there's over 1,000 jobs sitting in Tech Park. We have 5 of the top 10 defence companies in that precinct. It's over 114 different businesses across a broad group of industries there. But how do they connect to the other precincts is a very challenging one. We have agricultural technology companies sitting in Tech Park right next to our defence companies, and whether or not they talk to each other about their satellites or their technology or their AI, I couldn't tell you. We'd love to see them doing that, but whether or not they're connecting to the other agricultural precincts such as Waite Institute and the companies that are sitting around there, they certainly find it challenging to connect across all of the other precincts that South Australia has. So if that's a measure of success, that one's a challenging one. If jobs and high prestige companies are a success measure, then we're going great guns.
Sorry. I just thought it'd be helpful to share the OECD data analysis that we did of looking at STEM fields. So particularly, South Australia, if we were a country, where do we sit in the OECD? And that was some really, so looking at citation metrics as the measure for excellence, we actually sit in the top half of the OECD in many of the STEM fields. We're actually in the top quartile for our science excellence. There are some fields that we are sitting in the top 3 of OECD. So South Australia as a country, top 3. And there's a couple where we actually sit above the OECD. And when you compare to other states of Australia, we also sit above them. And then there are others that we sit up there, but below those states. But in terms of the performance, when you think of that, when we actually then look at publications of where we've got industry collaboration, we are in the 4th quartile. I think it's only Earth Science is the only one that we come in at the 2nd quartile that's consistent. So clearly there's something we can do better in connecting up, as everyone has said.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. That's really illuminating. So I think that actually leads to my next question about how actually we measure that success, right? So that actually I can see that to measure the performance of the science, technology park and precincts that have different terms, actually a very challenging job because what actually they're set up for. Now, before I actually move on to that particular question, can I actually, maybe I think that for the benefit of friends online in Japan and also some of us here, is how many science technology park or precinct districts, different names, but same nature. So how many of them do we have here in South Australia at the moment? Any one that can share some of the information to us?
That is a very tricky one because again, it depends on the definition, right?
But broader,
everyone seems to have a different understanding of, here today you've heard the term hub, cluster, precinct, science park, district, neighbourhood. So to really understand, I guess, we're really focused on, what are the major districts that we're looking at, and, we're seeing, probably 3 stand out, but we know that sitting under that, there are, technology park that is probably at a stage where it now needs to take a look. It has the potential that it can become an innovation district through the creation of leadership and a strategy that can join together the businesses that are to connect them up, and also that knowledge transfer between the districts that doesn't seem to be happening. So I think, some people would say there's, hundreds of them when you start to think of little shop fronts that might have a colliding of just for startups or entrepreneur hubs. So I don't think you can actually put a number on it because of the definition and also the maturity scale of where they all sit.
I'll add to that and extend it, because really the precinct nomenclature, the precinct word is fairly distinct, and there's an idea about what that means. whether it's a site like Tonsley, which is a site, you know, it's got a boundary. It's pretty bounded. Tech Park, less bounded. But to follow on from what you're saying, when we look at the geography of innovation and entrepreneurship more broadly, and if you count every single co-working space, I drove past one that I didn't know of the other day. I can't remember where I was, but just there it was, you know, there's another co-working space. And every time you have a co-working space, you've basically got a geography of innovation and entrepreneurship, and how well they are stocked and stacked and supported and is a matter for question. But I think it's interesting to expand that sense of precinctness into the broad geography of innovation itself, innovation entrepreneurship itself. Alan, did you want the mic?
See, I've taken notes around all this. So the one thing that I wanted to mention that Yvette Van Einerman mentioned yesterday, she had a graphic up there. She had 8 precincts sort of across, including weight. You're right. So there is an agricultural one. So there's a number of 8 kind of sounds nice, doesn't it? But really, my answer to that is either too many or not enough. And it depends on how you look at it. There's too many if they're not connected up and you become too fragmented as a state. It's not enough if we don't actually work out our own strengths and actually make sure we have the solid contribution to those strengths in the state.
Thank you. That's a really good answer. I always say that when we actually look at the science technology parks or innovation hubs or districts, and really it's not actually the nomenclature part that matters, is how actually we set them up, how we operate them, and how we actually see the connections so that draw upon the synergies. In fact, actually linked to my earlier question, how they perform, and the very excellent, I would say, the answers and from the panel is that how we measure, how we define a success. So it actually prompted me to think that since we're talking about innovation ecosystem in these 2 days, we talk about the science and technology parks as ecosystems, both locally, globally. So wouldn't they actually be feasible or ideal if we can actually measure the success of a science technology park as an ecosystem? Then the question is how actually we measure the performance of the ecosystem and what actually should be encompassed in the ecosystem. And so do you actually have any thoughts to share on this? If we define science technology park as an ecosystem, and what actually makes it as an ecosystem?
I'll have a crack at that because the microphone was in front of me. It's a bit like the reverse. It's a bit like the reverse of peeling an onion. It's how far out do you actually go? Do you have an inward-looking measure about performance of science parks and innovation precincts where essentially they're a law unto themselves, and if you've got a well-functioning piece of real estate, they're successful? Or do we take that broader ecosystem approach and talk about how do we measure the spillovers that actually stimulate an economy around them and reorient a state? Andrew Beer in his presentation yesterday talked about evolutionary theory and dependence and path dependence, et cetera, et cetera. I actually see innovation as how do you tilt that path dependency into a direction that builds on the skills that you actually have to capture a new opportunity. And my view is that doesn't just happen within the hallowed walls of something that's defined as a technology park or a precinct. I think that if a innovation precinct or a technology park isn't having an impact on the broader community, isn't creating a narrative for investment within a state, isn't an anchor on itself to attract new investment, to give kids going through school hope that they've got jobs in a local community, I don't think that they are successful in that measure. But the ecosystem is really an interesting one, because how far do you actually go? Do you bring in the things like the Deloittes, the Ernst & Youngs, the KPMG as part of that innovation system? And I would argue, yes, they really are important. IP professionals, etc. So I think that in measuring an ecosystem, we can go so wide that it becomes an exercise in gathering data purely for academic interest, rather than just, what are the professional opportunities that arise out of this?
Yeah.
I just wanted to raise the New South Wales Innovation and Productivity Commission. They wrote a 2018 report that was a really interesting report that looked at innovation districts, and it was based on the Brookings Institute research that was undertaken, and they came up with 7 factors for success of how you could really look at an innovation district. So that was around, and we've had a discussion just before around the importance of leadership. Good leadership, strategy, vision, pulling together the stakeholders that are part of the innovation districts that are willing to bring through the change. Your culture and collaboration. So the importance of a group of people willing to take risks, and that realising that research and innovation has risk factors, your willingness to want to work together and collaborate. So competitors who collaborate, but they also compete. Then you've also got your amenities and infrastructure. So they are about creating those spaces. If you think of Tech Park, if some of those buildings were perhaps retrofitted to have spaces where public and research could come together and collide with ideas, perhaps we could actually see maybe some people who aren't contributing into productivity, such as women and minority groups. We could be getting them introduced to the idea of starting a business, or there's lots of good ideas out there. The ability for access into a district, so the access through bike paths, walking trails, public transport, the ease of, if you think of Tonsley, you can hop on a train in 20 minutes and you can be there connecting. You can't do that in Sydney. You'd be having to have a meeting one day and then a meeting another day, because they don't have that ability to easily move from one place to the other. And then it's your competitive advantage and market drivers. So, what is that niche or pull factor that the talent that the innovation district might actually have, that the research that's happening, that if you think of, say, Akron, Ohio, where their polymer science is their whole reason why the world's best, and the whole reason why people go there. So what is that exists within the district that basically no one else has, or that is best in show? I guess they're probably how I'd look at measuring.
I would also see some measure of success as to how many of those startups, like proper startups, are rolling from one level to the next, So in Tech Park, we have various elements where you can start off in your own little office, and then you can get a bigger space and a bigger space and a bigger space. And I think it should be a measure that is, you're seeing a good roll through of those companies growing, and then growing out of your park, and maybe building their own thing within your park, or building it within another precinct. We have within Tech Park the Polaris Business Centre. So we do work with minorities. The city of Salisbury has a very diverse, culturally diverse community. So we are working with Afghani women groups, all sorts of startup businesses. They're probably not going to be starting a business in Tech Park. The rents are too high. They certainly can start their journey in Tech Park and keep coming back to utilise some of the conference facilities when we're running programming. But certainly that link across businesses, and I find this with defence, they're not that innovative, even though that's what they're there to do. They're not taking risks with each other and reaching out across the park. It would be great to see them doing that. That would be success, I think.
I'm just going to jump in and then I'll pass it to you with a really quick one to pick up on the cycling through of startups. We all know that the vast majority of startups don't continue. And I just want to add that facet that in a way, there's a success to that, because if the more you cycle those people through, you're actually changing a knowledge base, a skills base, a capacity base really broadly. So it can be, you know, I don't know if anyone else has heard innovation theatre, but, you know, certainly working at New Venture Institute, working at Tonsley, there were times when, you know, we were even looking at our own programs and going, is this innovation theatre? Is this entrepreneurship theatre? Is this the rubber on the road? But I do think that there is something to be said for exposing people, as many as you can, to design thinking, entrepreneurship. Yep, I do. I think it's really, really valuable. And I think there's this really nice success measure that's really intangible. And I don't know quite how you measure that one, but that you slowly, bit by bit, change the face or the quality of your skills base in a place.
Interesting that you ask about ecosystems, because that does change the language and change the shape of what we're actually talking about. Just now we're going through working up an academic paper. I don't know whether it's allowed to be, considering our, anyway, I'll move on. So, and what we're actually doing is looking at the ecosystem literature with a fairly open mind around what that is. And we assumed that there'd be three kind of outcomes in terms of it'll be a social direction in terms of some of the equity issues, the minorities and migrants, etc. We assumed that there would be an industrial revitalization or regeneration that might be there. We also assumed that there's an economic reason why you do this. So we thought, let's have a look at the very broad section of ecosystem literature and really try and pick out what that is, with a view to understanding what the functions were. And what we thought we'd actually observe is some differences in the functions and the people, the actors within the system. But as we got into the literature and really started to tease that out, it didn't matter which of your starting points you were at, they ended up the kind of same sort of functions. So just in terms of ecosystems, it's a much more open concept in terms of where we're actually heading, but they join a lot of dots. So, and that's the young and peeling I think you're referring to.
Okay, thank you. That's very good insights. In fact, I would say that Ryan didn't, when they introduced me, one thing didn't mention, actually, my background is more engineering, so actually by mechanical engineering by training. So when I actually look at the systems or ecosystems, things actually come to my mind is how you define the boundary. So that's actually typical engineering thinking. You know, when you look at the system, say, well, what's the system boundary? So actually come to this particular concept of ecosystem for innovation. I think that actually, to me, is more like this boundary actually keep evolving. So it may start with something physical, something small, but so naturally over time, it will grow. And it will encompass many different stakeholders and the parts, like Greg mentioned, you know, how actually we encompass that and, you know, bring that one into the fold is important. Things we can measure, we can improve. So therefore, how actually we measure the success of the ecosystem, particularly, you know, in that kind of journey of the, when they evolve. So one thing I do pick up is my next question for the panel is, I think one commonality I can see that from your answers is what's the impact when we measure the success of the ecosystem, technology parks, innovation hubs, how actually it impacts the community, how actually it translates into development in the regions around us or it operates in. So my question here is, do you have any comments on how actually this science parks, technology parks, innovation hubs in SA can actually better help the regional development? I wonder whether, you know, anyone want to share the thought on?
Okay, so I just want to start with your boundaries question, because that is an interesting one. The idea of boundaries is important for an ecosystem, so as you know what's in it, but it's also important so as you know what comes in and what goes out. So you don't actually define your measurement, if you like, through the boundary, except you're able to allocate the kind of metrics that you're interested in as either inside or across that boundary. So I thought that might be useful to think about. With your respect to the idea of collaborations and community, one of the pieces of work I did a little while ago was just looking at the SA ecosystem. And I interviewed a bunch of people like you normally do, and sort of get a cross-section of the ecosystem stakeholders to try and understand this, and then coded out a number of things. And what became central in that is the idea of community in our coding. And that meant from a university perspective, we were really interested in the idea of, yes, education and research, that's kind of bread and butter. But then you see the entrepreneurial ecosystem really adds that entrepreneurship awareness and kind of, there is a career opportunity in this, there is a growth and prospective opportunity in that, and that becomes part of what the university would do. And there's also the idea of incubating those ideas. And it's not only the ideas of the companies, it's incubating those fledgling entrepreneurs to actually work through. And that's part of what serving the community is about in terms of regional development. The other aspect of this was there's a number of services that the universities can provide, and some of it's just research and knowledge output that can be part of it. Some of it can be problem solving, where the problems come to us rather than the problems going out. Others can be risk management and sort of saying we want to do these sorts of things within the community, and the university can serve as a trusted source of information and a keeper of information, if you like, which will help people understand risk and manage risk in certain decisions, particularly at regional development levels. Yeah, and there's the open collaboration was another aspect of people just working together. So there's a number of things at the university particularly, so I'm directing my answer from the university, I guess, for this one. But keeping that open system going or open collaborations going is another part of it, because that strengthens the fabric of community.
I'm going to tell you a little story. So I was at Tonsley for 5 years as deputy director there, and that was from the beginning of Tonsley when we moved into the brand new beautiful Flinders University building there. The only other things on site was TAFE down the southern end, and Siemens had an anchor tenant had moved in. And so, you know, it really was from the beginning. Prior to that, I was within Flinders University in another different unit that was looking at the transformation of the South, as was said before. And in that capacity was part of committees and thought groups about what Flinders was going to do at Tonsley and how that was going to work. So Tonsley is, you've seen the pictures, under a great big sawtooth roof, old factory. It's a massive old factory. And so when we moved in and it was a windy, dusty, cold, beautiful factory in the process of being regenerated. And, you know, I loved it because I love a bit of that stuff. It's great to watch it being built and knocked down and all of that stuff. But I think it took only a few months, really, like certainly less than a year, when something interesting happened on a rainy day. I walked out underneath it's called the MAB, the main assembly building. So they've kept the heritage of the name there for MAB, that big sawtooth roof. And I went out to get a coffee one day, and there was a family there having a picnic, and the kids were riding their scooters around. And then that happened again, and then that happened again, and it kept happening. And now if you go down on the weekend to Tonsley, you will probably see some roller derby trainers who were training for roller derby down there in all of their gear. You will quite likely see some kids scooting around and having a lot of fun. And it is actually, it's been a really interesting thing that did happen completely spontaneously. And I'll put my hand up because one of those early instances was me saying to my sister, hey, I know it looks like it's going to rain for your outdoor birthday party for my nephew. Why don't you go and do it at Tonsley? Because there's a nice big roof. And I think that's interesting. It's like an interesting aspect of the physical built environment, that it's created a beautiful concrete, or there's a beautiful concrete and a lovely roof, and you can skate and scoot around and do all sorts of stuff there like that. There was one more thing I was going to say, but I can't remember what it was. No, I think that, oh no, that's what I was going to say. In contrast, even after 5 years, and even now, I think people still talk about going into Tonsley. And I'm going, there is no in, it's just Tonsley. You're not going in anywhere. So this is another aspect of the physical layout, is same with Tech Park. There's a road in and there's a road out, and there's a limitation to the porosity of the boundary. So I think that's an interesting kind of push and pull with Tonsley. Like, people go there, and if this is community people who go there because they can. But at the same time, there's still people who perceive this boundary of going in.
I think your commentary on boundary is really interesting. Tech Park definitely has a boundary. I don't pay much attention to boundaries. Greg will tell you that. But what I found most interesting was actually our largest university neighbour across the road. Sometimes when I'm talking to people, don't feel like they're part of Tech Park. And I find that amazing, because I just kind of bring you all in and, you know, I call you part of Tech Park. But that road in between is enough to make people in the rest of Mawson Lakes feel like they're not part of it. So that's an interesting comment on boundary, which, you know, everything has a boundary, I guess, and that's just the nature of things. I think in terms of community, you know, these parks are successful if they start giving our children careers and the opportunity to dream and the opportunity to see something beyond where they are right now. I think there's not a lot of visibility sometimes of some of those careers sitting in technology parks, because they are quite high level roles that you're talking about, high level education that you're talking about. And they're not always sitting in affluent suburbs. Actually, they're very rarely sitting in affluent suburbs. So if we have a generation that is reconnecting with their STEM at school and getting into those types of things at uni to then think about one day coming back, then that's a good thing. Certainly workforce is a massive issue for all of our companies in our park. They are really requiring a local engagement in order to fill their people requirements.
I just wanted to build on from the boundary discussion. And so this is why we've sort of picked up the language in government around calling them districts and neighbourhoods. So, you know, it's to move around. If you think precinct, you do sort of frame it as a, you know, to the gutter and defined by the buildings that's in it. But, you know, if you sort of start to think of a district, it's more than just, for instance, Adelaide Biomed City, if you think that, you know, it might just be the hospital, the university buildings, you've got Samari there, but actually it's starting to spill across the road. You know, you've got Fuse Tech across the road, you've got, I think, Biocena down at Theberton. So if you start to stretch that health medical precinct down, you know, you can hop on a tram, get to Theberton, there you've got a neighbourhood. So why are we bounding to just where people are specifically place-based? And I'm not sure if Yvette Van Eenenham yesterday when she spoke, if she talked about bringing in a layer of membership. So it's about, you know, you've got your partners, people who are actually located on these districts, but if you can start to think about affiliate members or businesses that want to feel that they can go into, you know, most people think, oh, I can't go there. It's hospitals or SAMRI is for researchers. But if people start to feel like, well, I've got a membership there, I'm part of it, they can just walk through the doors. You know, so it's trying to break down some of those walls that I think sort of existed, you know, for there's many businesses that we've spoken to that are doing, you know, that we can't go into a university, like they're full of smart people, you know, so it's breaking down those barriers, and that's why we're sort of bringing in that language, and then touching in on the bit about the skills base and, you know, the connection to community. Absolutely spot on, exactly what, you know, the purpose of what they're used for, and the ability for a place, if you can start to bring in, you know, frontier technology capability centres, so places that businesses can go to see what are the frontier or the next technologies, you know, your quantum materials, start to understand. You know, World Economic Forum has said in 5 years' time, this is coming. What might that mean for my business? What might that be an understanding of, so that I can sort of build through some resilience into my business by understanding that. And also, I guess, kids, you know, if you think about that skill, you only can be what you can see. So if they can go into Tonsley, go skateboarding, bump into I don't know, an astrophysicist, or, you know, and have a conversation. Maybe one day then they won't do, I want to be a doctor or a lawyer, I want to be an astrophysicist. So this is the value that we can start to leverage from our innovation districts that I think we're not quite doing, but there's huge value in doing that.
Thank you very much. I think that is a fantastic, and there's a lot of gems in your response in relation to the ecosystems. What I don't know how the audience and both on the floor and online think, but I can feel almost start to envisage what actually an ideal situation for ecosystem looked like, but couldn't, and I'll try to get it right. A bit difficult for me, but what actually, although we've got 5 minutes over time, but I will not let you go without giving you a last question, because I think that with all the wealth of knowledge here, what in your view, I would like to ask all the panel here, you know, what in your view, looking in the future, an ideal element of, you know, or ideal type of science, technology or innovation ecosystems should look like, in your view? If you can design one, or if you can dream one. So kind of, I can see some of the interesting elements and the key elements from your response, but I really would like to tease it out, and so for us to envisage a really a good example, a good feature, characteristic of ecosystem. So could you actually give us your dream about what actually and a perfect or ideal?
We were all waiting for someone to pick that up, and we're all going like, I'm not picking that up, you pick that up. I'm going to throw a few words out there, I guess, rather than sort of paint a picture, but a few words that I think are really important in response to that question. Excellence is one of them, and Carolyn spoke about that. Knowledge, of course, play, creativity, joy, because we actually run on those things. That's actually what we as humans run on. If we have those things taken away from us, play, creativity, joy, we don't work very well. So I think that's really, for me, that's really, really important. That in terms of what does it physically look like, I mean, that has to thread into the built environment, has to thread into everything that's there, but it has to thread into attitudes as well, the attitudinal environment. You know, of the entrepreneurial world talks a lot about risk and fear of failure and all of that sort of stuff. I'd stick with words like play and creativity, because when you're playing in a creative way, you don't have fear of failure. You don't even need to use the word, because you know that you're doing something that is in itself unbounded, boundary thing I could go on about for days, but I'm not going to. So I think those things for me are really important. I do think, well, one comment on boundaries, I do think there needs to be a good level of porosity. So I'm less a fan of boundaries perhaps. And then my final comment I think would be a place where that fits multiple levels of people, and maybe that comes back to the universities are full of clever people, but the world is full of people. So, you know, people need to be able to find where they fit in these big systems, big knowledge, play, creativity, innovation-y kind of systems. All right, who's next?
Probably two or three things come to my mind. One is the role of government, and I think Kevin touched on it before in terms of Singapore having a long-term vision. In Australia, we're very much bounded by electoral cycles and changes of government, and on thence the fortunes of emerging science and technology parks can rise and can fall. So I think Carolyn had something up there about having impatient capital to drive commercialisation and get ideas to market. I also think that it would be ideal for there to be almost patient investment by government over the long term as well to underpin the operating systems for those parks. Secondly, I'll jump in on the boundary thing as well. My dream would be that science parks outgrow their boundaries. They spill over, they merge seamlessly into the community. And in that way, they are central parts of an innovation-led economic development strategy. For some, it becomes a bit hard. I know that when Holden closed, one of the things that we did in Northern Adelaide was to pitch to the government that Technology Park be reinvested in as a central part of an innovation-led recovery for the North to fill the gap that the departure of the automotive sector had. And it was all a little bit too hard, so it ended up being a few grants given out to small businesses, which some of them worked and some of them didn't, and a few thousand there and a couple million over there. So I think that was a really lost opportunity. So I can't remember whether it was Catherine or Paula who said it, those sort of things allow kids to aspire and to dream. I also think that they allow governments and industry to aspire and dream as well. So I see my vision for them about groups of activity that capture imagination, that capture global opportunities, that connect our businesses, our researchers, our professional services to others in the world, and that there's a commercial outcome from them. And I think also, when we look at locational theory, generally there's three things the classic is there's neoclassical location choice where people choose on cost. There's behavioural location choice where people choose because it's more internal to the company or internal to the decision makers. And then there's the institutional one, which is about knowledge spillovers to drive new growth. And I think that if we really build the number of firms going around that institutional, i.e. we value knowledge, and that behavioural one, we enjoy being there, we want to be there, and cost actually becomes a secondary consideration because the question of value emerges. So it almost goes to your product thing before. It's about how it creates value for the individual participants, and I think the dream is that it creates lots of value.
I didn't want to go last. Greg's probably said much of what I would say because we come from a fairly similar mindset. In my mind, accessibility into and out of those parks, so whether that be businesses working with each other and what it takes for that to happen, is usually some level of intervention, whether that be at a local government, state government or a federal government level. But accessibility to the universities. I know a lot of businesses that find universities very intimidating to talk to, even though that company is a very, very, very smart Boilermaker. They still don't want to cross that boundary. We're back to those because they're very scary, but also accessibility to the community. industrial parks, tech parks, science parks are not conducive to community, generally speaking, especially when you're talking old ones that aren't built to be accessible. They do need investment to be retrofitted for some of that consumer-facing interaction. You won't get the interaction and the accessibility any other way.
Guess I don't go last either. The one thought on my mind is no thought at all, in terms of it would be great if we weren't having these discussions. That is, the innovation ecosystem is entirely normal. We get on with life and we see the university across the road, we integrate with it, we move our technology around, we play, we have joy, and we're not having this. That might be because I'm really selfish and I want to stop researching this so as I can retire, but I'm not sure about it. But I think there's still some way to go in terms of actually reaching that. But it would be lovely to think the future of it is that it becomes so normal that we're not having these kind of conversations about trying to work out how to make them work.
There's not much more I can say. You guys have hit it definitely on the nail on the head. Other than not just one innovation district, but a connected system of knowledge transfer across many of our innovation districts is exactly what we'd like to see. And in terms of, you know, government responding with investment, I think some of that, while you know, they love their new shiny things, they like the, you know, the next idea and to just churn on to the next one, joining up with players with the innovation district. Once you get everyone coming together and collectively going to government, you know, with an idea, they can't really say no. Well, individually, everyone's coming through going, don't fund that university. You should fund our business, don't fund that. And then the university, don't fund that business. You should, you know, fund, you know, this one. Or so while that's happening, government goes, great, won't fund anything. So that joining up really is, I think, the key here. And it's a partnership between state, federal government, business and academia. I think the joining up there to really build something to create these, you know, the right mix for, you know, what we need in the state to drive forward and meet our priority sector needs.
Thank you.
And sorry, I just wanted to say as well, the boundary stuff, science has no boundaries.
That's a very, very good comments to summarize the discussion. So that actually, ecosystem should not have a boundary. It keep evolving. Yeah. So just okay. Maybe I will just take a liberty to speak my dream about the other ecosystem. I would like to see is it more in the region, moving from the city to the region. If we see more regional centers, more regional innovation ecosystems, and connect up, that I think that we will have a much better world, you know, for businesses, for communities. But thank you very much for the contribution of the panel. I'm sure that it's very beneficial for all of us. So let's put the hands together. Thanks.